The autumn wind cut through the Colorado mountains like a blade, carrying with it the scent of pine and the distant echo of pickaxes striking stone. In the mining town of Copper Ridge, where fortunes were made and lost with each swing of a hammer, nobody paid much attention to the slight figure in patched overalls who walked through the camp gates that October morning. The boy's name was Sam, or so the foreman's ledger would read. But beneath the dirt-stained cap and behind those carefully lowered eyes lived a secret that could destroy everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Clara Mae Whitmore had been running for 3 days when she first saw the smoke rising from the mining camp's chimneys. Her feet were blistered raw inside her dead brother's boots, and hunger gnawed at her stomach like a caged animal. The money she'd taken from her stepfather's hidden stash had run out in Denver, spent on the train ticket that brought her this far into the mountains. Now, with winter approaching and nowhere else to turn, she stood at the edge of Copper Ridge, watching the miners emerge from the depths of the earth like ghosts covered in coal dust. The idea had come to her during the long, sleepless nights in the freight car. She'd cut her auburn hair short with her father's old razor, the same one he'd used before consumption took him 2 years prior. The loose clothing she'd stolen from her stepbrother's trunk hung on her small frame, and she'd practiced deepening her voice until it cracked in just the right way to sound like a boy on the verge of manhood. It wasn't perfect, but it might be enough. The camp foreman, a grizzled man named Dutch Morrison, barely looked up from his ledger when she approached. His weathered hands moved across the pages with surprising delicacy, recording the daily output of silver ore that would eventually find its way to the smelters in Denver. "You looking for work, boy?" Dutch asked, not bothering to raise his eyes. A line of men stretched behind Clara, each one desperate for employment as the mining season reached its peak. "Yes, sir," Clara replied, keeping her voice low and steady. "I can work hard. Been mining with my uncle up in Leadville." The lie came easily, rehearsed during the long journey west. Dutch finally looked up, taking in her slight build and smooth cheeks. "You eat enough, son? These mines ain't no place for weaklings." "I'm stronger than I look," Clara insisted, flexing her arms beneath the worn fabric of her shirt. The months of hauling water and chopping wood for her stepfather had given her more muscle than most girls her age, though she still looked fragile compared to the weathered men around her. "Well, we're short-handed since the cave-in last month," Dutch muttered, making a note in his ledger. "You can start tomorrow." "Name?" "Sam," Clara said quickly. "Sam Whitmore." "Sam it is." "Bunk assignment is number 12 in the East Barracks. Meals are at sunrise and sunset. You work the day shift, 7 to 7. Any questions?" Clara shook her head, not trusting her voice. The relief was so overwhelming she felt dizzy. She had work, shelter, and food. For the first time in weeks, she might actually survive. The bunkhouse was a long, low building that smelled of unwashed bodies and tobacco smoke. Rows of narrow beds lined the walls, each one claiming a small space in the collective misery of the mining camp. Clara found bunk 12 and sat down heavily, her legs finally giving out from exhaustion. The mattress was thin and lumpy, but it was better than the hard ground she'd been sleeping on. "You the new kid?" The voice came from the bunk across the narrow aisle. Clara looked up to see a man in his 30s, with kind eyes and prematurely gray hair. He extended a calloused hand. "Name's Patrick O'Brien. Been working these mines for 8 years now." "Sam Whitmore," Clara replied, accepting the handshake and trying to make her grip firm without seeming to try too hard. "First time mining?" Patrick asked, settling back on his own bunk. "No, sir. Worked with my uncle up north." The lie was becoming easier each time she told it. "Good. These mountain mines are different from the placer claims, but the work's honest if you don't mind." "The dark." Patrick's voice carried a slight Irish accent that spoke of origins far from these Colorado peaks. Word of advice though, stay clear of Jake Brennan's crew. They're a rough bunch, and they don't take kindly to newcomers. Clara nodded, filing the information away. She'd learned early in life that survival often depended on knowing which men to avoid and which ones might offer protection. Patrick seemed like the latter, though she couldn't afford to trust anyone completely. The next morning came too soon, announced by the harsh clang of the breakfast bell. Clara joined the stream of miners heading to the mess hall, keeping her head down and her cap pulled low. The cook, a massive man with arms like tree trunks, slapped beans and salt pork onto tin plates with mechanical efficiency. The food was bland but filling, and Clara ate quickly, listening to the conversations around her. "Silver's running thin in Tunnel 5, one miner was saying. "Might have to go deeper." "Deeper means more danger," another replied. "That last cave-in nearly took Peterson's crew." "Better than no work at all," a third voice chimed in. "My wife's expecting another baby. Can't afford to be particular." Clara absorbed every word, learning the rhythms and concerns of this harsh world she'd entered. When the bell rang again, signaling the start of the workday, she followed the other miners to the equipment shed where they collected their tools, pickaxes, shovels, and small oil lamps that would provide their only light in the tunnels below. The mine entrance yawned before them like the mouth of some great beast. Clara's heart hammered as she followed the other miners into the darkness, her lamp casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. The tunnel sloped downward at a steep angle, supported by wooden beams that groaned ominously under the weight of the mountain above. "Stay close and watch your footing," Patrick warned, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "These tunnels can be treacherous if you don't know them." The work was brutal. Clara was assigned to a crew loading more cars with the silver bearing rock that other miners had blasted free from the tunnel walls. The chunks of stone were heavy and sharp-edged, and within an hour her hands were bleeding despite the thick gloves she wore. The air was thick with dust that made her eyes water and her throat burn, but she endured. Every shovelful of ore was proof that she could do this work, that she could survive in this man's world. The other miners in her crew seemed to accept her presence, though they spoke little during the long hours underground. The only sounds were the scrape of shovels, the rumble of loaded cars being pushed along the tracks, and the occasional crack of settling timbers. It was during her third day in the mines that Clara first noticed Marcus Sullivan. He worked with a different crew, one that handled the more dangerous job of setting explosive charges to break up the silver veins. Marcus was tall and lean, with dark hair and eyes that seemed to take in everything around him. Unlike the other miners, who moved with the weary efficiency of men who'd long since lost any joy in their work, Marcus seemed alert and alive, as if he saw something in the darkness that others missed. Clara first became aware of his attention when she caught him watching her during the midday break. The miners would gather in a wider section of the tunnel to eat their meager lunch and rest their aching muscles. Clara always found a spot away from the others, partly to maintain her disguise and partly because she felt more comfortable alone. "You're the new kid, aren't you?" Marcus's voice was quiet, but carried clearly in the confined space. He'd approached without her noticing, moving with a cat-like grace that seemed out of place in the clumsy world of mining. "Yes, sir," Clara replied, keeping her voice low and her eyes down. "Sam Whitmore." "Interesting name," Marcus said, settling down beside her on the rocky floor. "I knew a Whitmore family back in Missouri. Good people, but they had their share of troubles." Clara's pulse quickened. Was he testing her somehow? "Don't know about Missouri," she said carefully. "My family's from up north." "I'm sure they are," Marcus replied, but there was something in his tone that made Clara uneasy. "You work hard for someone so young. Most boys your age are still playing at being men." "Got no choice but to work hard," Clara said, which was true. "Enough." Marcus nodded, taking a bite of his bread and cheese. "We all got our reasons for being here." Some of us are running from something, others are running toward it. What about you, Sam? What brought you to Copper Ridge? The question hung in the air between them like smoke from their oil lamps. Clara felt trapped, aware that anything she said might reveal more than she intended. Just looking for honest work. She finally answered, honest work. Marcus repeated the words as if testing their flavor. That's a good answer, simple and clean, I like that. He stood up, brushing crumbs from his pants. See you around, Sam Whitmore, and be careful down here. The mountain has a way of testing people, seeing what they're really made of. After he left, Clara sat in the darkness, her heart racing. There had been something unsettling about the conversation, a sense that Marcus Sullivan saw more than he should. She would have to be more careful, more guarded. Discovery would mean more than just losing her job. It could mean exposure, scandal, and a return to the life she'd fought so hard to escape. But as the days passed, Clara found herself looking forward to those brief encounters with Marcus. He had a way of appearing when she least expected it, always with some casual comment or observation that seemed innocent enough on the surface. Yet Clara began to suspect that nothing about Marcus Sullivan was as simple as it appeared. During her second week in the mines, Clara witnessed something that changed her understanding of the man entirely. She was working late, helping to clear debris from a tunnel that had partially collapsed during the morning shift. Most of the other miners had already returned to the surface, but Clara volunteered to stay behind, partly because she needed the extra pay and partly because she felt safer in the mines than in the crowded bunkhous Itachi was loading rocks into a cart when she heard voices coming from a side tunnel she'd never entered before. One of the voices belonged to Marcus Sullivan, but he was speaking in a tone she'd never heard from him, urgent, commanding, and definitely not like a common miner. The assay reports are clear, Marcus was saying. There's a major vein running through the east wall of Tunnel 7. If we can get to it before Morrison realizes what's there, we can extract enough silver to set us up for life. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. And if we get caught? The second voice was nervous, higher pitched. We won't get caught. If we're smart about it. I've been watching the work schedules. There's a 2-hour window every Tuesday night when that section is empty. We go in, take what we can carry, and get out clean. Clara's blood ran cold. Marcus Sullivan wasn't just another miner. He was planning to steal from the mine. The casual way he spoke about it suggested this wasn't his first such scheme. She began to back away from the tunnel entrance, but her foot knocked against a loose stone, sending it clattering across the floor. The voices stopped immediately. Clara held her breath, pressing herself against the tunnel wall and praying that the darkness would hide her. After what felt like an eternity, she heard footsteps moving away deeper into the mine. She waited another 10 minutes before emerging from her hiding place, her hands shaking as she gathered her tools. The knowledge weighed on her like a stone. Marcus Sullivan was a thief, and she was probably the only person in the camp who knew it. The question was what to do with that information. If she reported him to Dutch Morrison, she'd be doing the right thing, but it would also mean drawing attention to herself. Questions would be asked about how she'd overheard the conversation, and her own secret might be discovered in the process. But if she said nothing and Marcus's theft was discovered, she could be accused of being an accomplice. The thought of being dragged before the territorial marshal, of having her true identity exposed in a courtroom, made her stomach churn with fear. That night, as she lay in her narrow bunk listening to the snores and murmurs of the other miners, Clara made a decision. She would confront Marcus Sullivan directly. It was risky, but it might be the only way to protect herself while stopping him from destroying his life and the lives of others. The opportunity came 3 days later when she encountered Marcus during the evening break. He was sitting alone, near the mine entrance, smoking a cigarette and watching the sun set behind the mountains. Clara approached him carefully, her heart pounding with nervousness. "Evening, Sam," Marcus said without looking up. "Long day?" "Long enough," Clara replied, settling down beside him. "Can I ask you something? Go ahead. What do you really do here? I mean, besides the mining." Marcus turned to look at her, his dark eyes unreadable in the gathering dusk. "That's an interesting question. What makes you think I do anything besides mining?" Clara took a deep breath. "I heard you talking the other night about Tunnel 7 and the silver vein." For a long moment, Marcus said nothing. Then he took a final drag from his cigarette and flicked it away into the darkness. "Did you now? And what exactly did you hear?" "Enough to know you're planning something that could get you hanged." Clara's voice was steady, but inside she was trembling. Marcus studied her face in the dim light. "You know, Sam, I've been watching you since you arrived. There's something different about you, something that doesn't quite fit with the story you've been telling." Clara's throat went dry. "I don't know what you mean." "I think you do." Marcus leaned closer, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "The way you hold yourself, the way you eat, the way you avoid the other miners during personal time. And your hands, they're soft for someone who's supposedly been mining for years." Clara started to stand up, but Marcus caught her wrist gently. "Easy there. I'm not your enemy, Sam. In fact, I think we might be able to help each other." "Help each other how?" Clara asked, though she was afraid she already knew the answer. "You keep quiet about what you heard, and I keep quiet about what I've figured out. Simple as that." Clara stared at him, her mind racing. "And if I refuse?" Marcus smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Then tomorrow morning, Dutch Morrison gets a very interesting report about the new miner who's been lying about who he really is. I'm sure the territorial marshal would be very interested in meeting you, Clara." The sound of her real name hit her like a physical blow. Clara felt the world spinning around her, all her carefully constructed defenses crumbling in an instant. "How did you?" "I've got friends in Denver who know how to ask the right questions." Clara Mae Whitmore, age 19, ran away from her stepfather's house about a month ago. "There's a reward posted for information about your whereabouts." Clara's legs gave out, and she sank back down onto the rocky ground. All her planning, all her sacrifice, and it had come to this. She was trapped, caught between exposure and complicity in a crime that could destroy them both. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus's expression softened slightly. "Right now, just your silence. Later, well, we'll see. You're smarter than most of the men in this camp, and you've got more courage than half of them combined. Those are valuable qualities." As the last light faded from the sky, Clara Mae Whitmore realized that her masquerade had led her into something far more dangerous than she'd ever imagined. The mine that had offered her refuge had become a trap, and the man who'd seen through her disguise now held her fate in his hands. But somewhere in the darkness of that realization, a small flame of defiance still burned. She'd survived her stepfather's cruelty, the journey west, and the brutal work in the mines. Whatever Marcus Sullivan had planned for her, she would find a way to survive that too. She had to, because the alternative was a return to the life she'd risked everything to escape. The mountain wind whistled through the camp, carrying with it the promise of winter and the scent of snow. In the distance, the mine entrance yawned, like an open mouth waiting to swallow them all into its depths. And somewhere in that darkness, Clara Mae Whitmore began to plan her next move in a game where the stakes were higher than she'd ever imagined. The days following, Marcus Sullivan's revelation crawled like wounded animals. Clara found herself constantly looking over her shoulder, waiting for the moment when Dutch Morrison would call her into his office, or when the territorial marshal would arrive to drag her back to her stepfather's house. But that moment never came. Instead, Marcus seemed content to let her stew in her own fear, occasionally catching her eye across the mess hall with a knowing smile that made her stomach turn. Work in the mines became a torment of anticipation. Every time Clara heard footsteps approaching her position, she expected to see Marcus materialize from the shadows with some new demand. The weight of his knowledge pressed down on her like the mountain itself, making each breath feel labored and each movement deliberate. It was during the fourth day of this psychological warfare that Marcus finally made his move. Clara was working alone in a remote section of Tunnel 9, hauling broken rock to the main cart line. The work was punishing, but she preferred it to the company of other miners who might notice her increasing nervousness. "You're developing quite a reputation as a hard worker," Marcus said, stepping out of the darkness so suddenly that Clara nearly dropped her shovel. "Dutch Morrison was just telling me how impressed he is with your dedication." Clara sat down her tools, knowing that running would be useless in the confined space. "What do you want, Marcus? Direct, I like that." He moved closer, his lamp casting strange shadows on the tunnel walls. "I've been thinking about our arrangement, and I believe it's time to make it more mutually beneficial. I'm already keeping quiet about your theft plans, and I appreciate that, truly. But silence is a passive contribution. I need something more active from you." Clara's pulse quickened. "Such as?" Marcus reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "There's going to be a delivery of payroll money tomorrow evening. It arrives by wagon from Denver, usually around sunset. Dutch keeps it in his office safe until payday the following morning. You want to steal the miners' wages?" Clara's voice was sharp with disbelief. "I want to borrow them temporarily. The money will be replaced once I've made my fortune from the silver operation." Marcus's tone was matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing the weather. "All I need from you is a small favor." Clara stared at him, trying to process what he was asking. "You're insane. That's theft from every man in this camp." "It's business, Clara, and since you're now my business partner, you'll help me make it happen." "I won't do it." Marcus sighed, folding the paper and tucking it back into his jacket. "I was hoping you'd be more reasonable. You see, refusing to help isn't really an option anymore. You know too much about my plans, which makes you either an accomplice or a witness. And witnesses have a tendency to disappear in mining camps." The threat hung between them like smoke from their oil lamps. Clara felt the tunnel walls closing in around her, the weight of the mountain pressing down with suffocating force. "What do you want me to do?" "Nothing too difficult. You'll create a distraction in the main camp while I handle the safe. A small accident, perhaps, or a fight between miners. Something that draws attention away from Dutch's office." "And if I refuse?" Marcus smiled, but his eyes remained cold. "Then I'll have to find another way to ensure your cooperation. Perhaps a letter to your stepfather, letting him know exactly where to find his missing daughter. I understand he's quite anxious for your return." Clara's blood ran cold. The thought of Silas Hartwell's cruel hands and vicious temper made her physically ill. She'd rather face a cave-in than return to that house of horrors. "You're a monster," she whispered. "I'm a survivor, just like you. The difference is that I'm not afraid to take what I need." Marcus checked his pocket watch. "You have until tomorrow evening to decide. But Clara... Choose wisely. Your entire future depends on it." After he left, Clara stood alone in the darkness, her mind racing through impossible choices. She could report Marcus to Dutch Morrison, but that would mean exposing her own deception. She could run again, but where would she go with no money and winter approaching? Or she could help Marcus steal the payroll and become a criminal herself. None of the options offered escape from the trap she'd walked into. The mine that had promised salvation was becoming her prison, and the man who discovered her secret was the warden holding the keys. That night, Clara lay awake in her bunk, listening to the sounds of sleeping miners around her. Patrick O'Brien's Gentle snoring mixed with the whispered conversations of men who couldn't find rest. These were good men, honest men who worked brutal hours for wages that barely kept their families fed. The thought of stealing from them made her sick, but the alternative was worse. If she refused to help Marcus, he would expose her, and she would be dragged back to Silas Hartwell's house to face punishment that would make the mines seem like paradise. Her stepfather was a man who believed in harsh discipline for wayward children, and Clara's defiance would not go unpunished. As dawn broke over the mountains, Clara made her decision. She would help Marcus steal the payroll, but she would find a way to make things right afterward. Perhaps she could anonymously tip off Dutch Morrison about the theft, or find some way to return the money before the miners discovered it was missing. It was a desperate plan, but it was the only one that offered any hope of survival. The next day crawled by with agonizing slowness. Clara went through the motions of her work, loading ore cars and hauling debris, but her mind was elsewhere. She studied the layout of the camp, noting the positions of buildings and the routines of the various workers. If she was going to create a distraction, it would have to be something believable, something that wouldn't raise suspicions about her involvement. The opportunity presented itself during the evening meal. Jake Brennan, the miner Patrick had warned her about, was drinking heavily and picking fights with anyone who looked at him sideways. Clara had been watching him for weeks, noting his quick temper and violent tendencies. He would be perfect for her purposes. As the miners finished their supper and began to drift toward the bunkhouses, Clara made her move. She approached Brennan's table where he sat with his crew, all of them rough men with scarred hands and hard eyes. "Excuse me," Clara said, keeping her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I think you dropped this." She held out a crumpled piece of paper on which she'd written some insulting comments about Brennan's work habits and personal hygiene. The words were crude and specific, the kind of thing that would enrage a man like him. Brennan snatched the paper and squinted at it in the dim light. As he read, his face grew red with anger. "Who wrote this?" he demanded, lurching to his feet. "I found it on the floor near your bunk," Clara said innocently. "Thought you should know someone was spreading lies about you." Brennan's eyes swept the mess hall, looking for a target for his rage. They settled on Tom Fisher, a quiet man who worked in Tunnel 6 and kept to himself. "Fisher," Brennan roared. "You got something to say about me?" Fisher looked up from his coffee, confusion clear on his weathered face. "I don't know what you're talking about, Jake." "Don't lie to me." Brennan waved the paper in the air. "This is your handwriting, isn't it? Talking about how I can't do my job, how I smell like a pig." The mess hall grew quiet as men turned to watch the confrontation. Clara slipped toward the door, her heart pounding. The distraction was working better than she'd hoped. "That's not my handwriting," Fisher protested, standing up to face Brennan. "I've never written anything about you. Liar!" Brennan threw the first punch, catching Fisher on the side of the head and sending him sprawling across a table. The impact scattered tin plates and cups, creating a tremendous crash that echoed through the camp. Within seconds, the mess hall erupted into chaos. Fisher's friends rushed to his aid while Brennan's crew backed up their leader. Fists flew and furniture crashed as the fight spread throughout the room. Men poured out of the bunkhouses to see what was happening, drawn by the sounds of violence and shouting. Clara used the confusion to slip away from the crowd and make her way toward Dutch Morrison's office. The small building sat at the edge of the camp, its windows glowing with lamplight. She could see Dutch himself standing in the doorway, watching the fight with a mixture of anger and resignation. "Sam!" Dutch called out as she approached. "Get over here and help me break this up." Clara's heart sank. She was supposed to be helping Marcus, not Dutch Morrison. But refusing would look suspicious, so she nodded and followed the foreman toward the mess hall. The fight was in full swing when they arrived. Tables were overturned. Food was scattered across the floor. and blood was flowing from several split lips and black eyes. Dutch waded into the melee with the confidence of a man who'd broken up countless such fights, grabbing men by their shirts and pulling them apart. "That's enough," he roared, his voice carrying over the chaos. "Next man who throws a punch spends." The night in the tool shed. The threat of punishment in the freezing tool shed was enough to cool most tempers. The fighters separated reluctantly, glaring at each other but unwilling to risk Dutch's wrath. Clara found herself helping to separate Jake Brennan from Tom Fisher, both men bloody and breathing hard. "What started this?" Dutch demanded, looking around the room for answers. "Brennan started it," someone called out. "Accused Fisher of writing lies about him." Dutch turned to Brennan, his face hard with disapproval. "That true, Jake?" Brennan held up the crumpled paper, now stained with blood. "Found this garbage near my bunk. Someone's been spreading lies about me." Dutch took the paper and examined it, his expression growing more severe as he read. "This is nasty work, all right. But that's no excuse for starting a brawl. You're docked 2 days' pay, and if I catch you fighting again, you're out of the camp." As Dutch continued to restore order, Clara realized her opportunity was slipping away. The distraction had worked too well. Instead of drawing attention away from Dutch's office, it had brought him directly into the middle of the chaos. Marcus would be furious, and her failure to help him would only make her situation worse. But as she helped clean up the mess hall, Clara noticed something that made her blood run cold. The piece of paper she'd used to start the fight was still in Dutch's hand, and he was studying it with growing interest. The handwriting was obviously feminine, despite her attempts to disguise it. If Dutch examined it too closely, he might realize that no man in the camp could have written it. "Sam," Dutch said suddenly, his voice sharp with suspicion. "Come here." Clara's legs felt like water as she approached the foreman. Dutch held out the paper, his eyes fixed on her face. "You said you found this near Brennan's bunk?" "Yes, sir," Clara replied, praying her voice wouldn't betray her. "Funny thing about this handwriting," Dutch continued. "It's awfully neat for a minor, almost like a woman's hand." The accusation hit Clara like a physical blow. Around them, the mess hall grew quiet as other miners stopped their cleaning to listen. Clara felt their eyes on her, studying her face and posture with new interest. "I wouldn't know about that," Clara said carefully. "I just found it on the floor." Dutch nodded slowly, but his expression remained suspicious. "Maybe you did. But I'm going to ask around, see if anyone recognizes this handwriting. If I find out someone's been playing games in my camp, there'll be hell to pay." As Dutch folded the paper and tucked it into his pocket, Clara knew her time was running out. The foreman was too experienced to be fooled for long, and once he started investigating, her deception would be exposed. She had to find a way out of the camp before that happened, but first she had to deal with Marcus Sullivan, the crowd in. The mess hall was beginning to disperse, with miners heading back to their bunkhouses or gathering in small groups to discuss the fight. Clara used the confusion to slip away, her mind racing with plans and possibilities. She had to find Marcus and explain what had happened, then figure out a way to escape before Dutch's investigation revealed her true identity. But as she made her way through the darkening camp, Clara realized that her problems were just beginning. The failed distraction had put her in an impossible position, caught between Marcus's demands and Dutch's suspicions. With no clear path to safety, the mountain wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of snow and the promise of winter. In the distance, the mine entrance gaped like an open wound, waiting to swallow her back into its depths. And somewhere in the darkness, Clara May Whitmore prepared for the most dangerous gamble of her life. Clara found Marcus waiting in the shadows. Behind the equipment shed, his face a mask of controlled fury. The distant sounds of the continuing cleanup from the mess hall brawl provided cover for their conversation. But Clara could feel the weight of his anger like a physical presence in the cold mountain air. That was quite a performance, Marcus sighed, his voice deadly quiet. Though not exactly what we discussed. The plan went wrong, Clara replied, fighting to keep her voice steady. Dutch got involved directly instead of just watching from a distance. And now he's suspicious about the handwriting on that note you used. Marcus stepped closer, his eyes glittering in the lamplight from the distant buildings. Did you think? I wouldn't notice how perfectly feminine your script looked. You might as well have signed your real name. Clara's throat tightened. I tried to disguise it. You failed. And now Dutch Morrison is going to start asking questions that neither of us can afford to answer. Marcus began pacing, his boots crunching. On the frost-covered ground. The payroll wagon arrived an hour ago. I watched it roll right past Dutch's office while you were staging your little theater production. We can try again tomorrow. No. Marcus's interruption was sharp as a blade. There won't be a tomorrow. Dutch is already suspicious, and by morning he'll have figured out that no man in this camp could have written that note. Your disguise is finished, Clara. The finality in his voice made Clara's blood run cold. She'd known this moment would come eventually, but she'd hoped for more time, more options. What are you suggesting? I'm not suggesting anything. I'm telling you what's going to happen. Marcus stopped pacing and fixed her with a stare that seemed to pierce right through her carefully constructed facade. Tonight, you're going to help me get that payroll money. And then we're both leaving this camp forever. I won't help you steal from those men. You don't have a choice. Marcus's hand moved to his jacket, and Clara caught a glimpse of metal that might have been a knife handle. Because if you refuse, I'll make sure Dutch Morrison gets a very detailed report about his newest miner. And I'll make sure he knows exactly where to send the telegram about your whereabouts. Clara closed her eyes, feeling the trap closing around her like the walls of a collapsing mine shaft. Every choice led to disaster, every path ended in ruin. But perhaps there was still a way to minimize the damage, to protect the innocent men who would suffer from Marcus's greed. If I help you, she said slowly, what guarantee do I have that you won't just take the money and leave me to face the consequences? Marcus smiled, but there was no warmth in it. You don't have any guarantees except my word. But consider this. If you help me willingly, we split the money and both disappear into the mountains. If you refuse, I expose you anyway and take the money myself. At least cooperation gives you a chance at survival. The logic was brutal, but undeniable. Clara opened her eyes and looked at the man who held her fate in his hands. How do you plan to get into the Dutch's office? I've been studying his routine for weeks. Every night after the evening shift ends, he goes to check on the horses in the corral. Takes him about 20 minutes to make his rounds. That gives us a window to get in and out of his office. And the safe? Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch. Picked up some useful skills in my previous line of work. Safes like Dutch's are more for show than security. Most frontier camps can't afford the really sophisticated models. Clara stared at the lockpicking tools, realizing that Marcus Sullivan was far more dangerous than she'd initially believed. Who are you really? Someone who's very good at taking what he wants. And tonight, what I want is in Dutch Morrison's safe. Marcus tucked the tools back into his jacket. The question is whether you're going to help me get it, or whether you're going to force me to handle this the hard way. The threat hung between them like a loaded gun. Clara knew she was out of options, trapped between cooperation and exposure. But as she nodded her agreement, a plan began forming in her mind. If she was going to help Marcus commit this crime, she would find a way to make sure justice was served afterward. What do you need me to do? She asked. Keep watch. Position yourself where you can see both the office and the path to the corral. If Dutch comes back early, create another distraction. And Clara ... Marcus's voice dropped to a whisper. Don't even think about betraying me. I've survived worse situations than this by always being 2 steps ahead of everyone else. They waited in the shadows until the camp settled into its evening routine. Miners drifted toward the bunkhouses, their conversations muted by exhaustion and the cold mountain air. A few men lingered around the mess hall, but most were eager to get out of the biting wind that had started to blow down from the peaks. Clara watched Dutch Morrison emerge from his office and begin his nightly inspection of the livestock. The foreman moved with the careful precision of a man who'd spent years in positions of responsibility, checking each horse and mule with practiced efficiency. In the distance, the mine entrance yawned like a black mouth, waiting to swallow another day's worth of hopes and dreams. "Now," Marcus whispered, and they moved. Clara took up her position near the corner of the mess hall, where she could see both Dutch's office and the path to the corral. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she watched Marcus approach the office building, his movements fluid and confident. Whatever his background, he was clearly experienced in this kind of work. The lock on Dutch's office door proved no more challenging than Marcus had predicted. Within minutes, he disappeared inside, leaving Clara alone with her mounting anxiety. Every shadow seemed to hide a potential witness, every sound might herald discovery. The weight of what she was doing pressed down on her like the mountain itself. Dutch was taking his time with the horses, speaking softly to each animal as he checked their conditions. Clara counted the minutes, praying that Marcus would finish his work before the foreman completed his rounds. The cold wind whipped through the camp, carrying with it the scent of snow and the promise of winter storms. It was then that Clara noticed the light moving through the darkness toward Dutch's office. Someone was approaching with a lantern, walking with the purposeful stride of a man on official business. Clara's blood turned to ice as she recognized the figure. It was Deputy Marshal William Hayes, the territorial law enforcement officer, who made periodic visits to the mining camps. Hayes was supposed to be in Denver for another week. His unexpected presence meant disaster for both Clara and Marcus. If the deputy marshal discovered Marcus in Dutch's office, the consequences would be swift and severe. Frontier justice had little patience for thieves who preyed on honest working men. Clara faced an impossible choice. She could warn Marcus, helping him escape, but ensuring her own exposure when Hayes investigated the attempted theft. Or she could remain silent, allowing Marcus to be caught but preserving her own disguise for perhaps a few more days. The decision was made for her when Hayes changed direction, heading toward the corral instead of the office. Clara realized he was looking for Dutch Morrison, probably to discuss some official business. That gave her a narrow window to act. She slipped through the shadows toward Dutch's office, her heart pounding so hard she was sure it could be heard. Across the camp, the door stood slightly ajar, and she could see Marcus's silhouette bent over the safe in the corner. His lock-picking tools glinted in the lamplight as he worked with practiced skill. "Marcus," she whispered urgently, "we have to go, now." He looked up, his face tight with concentration. "Almost got it. Just need another minute." "We don't have a minute. The deputy marshal is here, and he's looking for Dutch." Marcus's hands stilled on the safe. "Hayes? He's not supposed to be back until next week. Tell that to him. He's at the corral right now, but he could come this way any second." For a moment, Marcus seemed frozen between greed and self-preservation. Clara could see the conflict playing out across his features, the desire to complete the theft warring with the need to escape before discovery. Finally, survival won out. "Damn," he muttered, gathering his tools. "We'll have to try again another time." But as they prepared to leave, the sound of approaching footsteps froze them both. Through the office window, Clara could see Deputy Marshal Hayes walking toward the building, his lantern casting long shadows across the ground. Behind him came Dutch Morrison, their conversation carrying clearly in the cold air. "Double quotes ... unusual amounts of theft in the camps lately," Hayes was saying. "Thought you should know there might be organized criminals working the mining region." "Haven't had any major problems here," Dutch replied. though there was some trouble tonight. Fight in the mess hall over a nasty note someone left lying around. Clara's stomach clenched. They were trapped in Dutch's office with nowhere to run, and the conversation outside was steering dangerously close to her own deception. Marcus grabbed her arm, his grip tight enough to bruise. "Back window," he whispered. "Move quietly." They crept toward the rear of the office, where a small window offered their only hope of escape. Marcus worked at the latch while Clara kept watch, her nerves stretched to the breaking point. The voices outside were getting closer, and she could hear Dutch's keys jingling as he prepared to unlock the door. The window finally gave way, and Marcus boosted Clara through the opening. She tumbled onto the cold ground behind the building, her knees scraping against the rocky soil. Marcus followed a moment later, landing with cat-like grace beside her. They pressed themselves against the back wall of the office, breathing hard and listening to the sounds from inside. Dutch and Deputy Marshal Hayes had entered the building, their conversation continuing as they settled into chairs. "That note you mentioned," Hayes was saying. "Mind if I take a look at it?" Clara's blood ran cold. The handwriting sample that had already raised Dutch's suspicions was about to be examined by a trained law enforcement officer. If Hayes was experienced in investigating crimes, he might immediately recognize the feminine script. "Sure thing," Dutch replied, and Clara heard the rustling of paper. "Found it after the fight." Something about the handwriting struck me as odd. There was a long pause, during which Clara imagined Hayes studying the note with professional interest. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful and concerned. "Dutch, this wasn't written by any man in your camp. The formation of the letters, the way the words flow together, this is definitely a woman's handwriting. And not just any woman, but someone with education, someone who's used to writing regularly." "That's what I was thinking," Dutch said grimly. "But there aren't any women in this camp except for Cookie's wife, and she can barely write her own name. Then you've got an imposter among your miners. Someone who's been lying about who they are from the day they arrived." Clara felt the world spinning around her. Her carefully constructed disguise was unraveling with each word spoken inside the office. Soon, Dutch would start questioning every miner in the camp, and her deception would be exposed. Beside her, Marcus was already moving, slipping away from the office and heading toward the shadows between the buildings. Clara followed, knowing that her fate was now tied to his whether she liked it or not. They were both fugitives now, both running from the law that was closing in around them. As they made their way through the darkened camp, Clara realized that everything she'd worked for was collapsing around her. The mind that had offered sanctuary was now a trap. The identity she'd created was crumbling, and the man who'd discovered her secret was leading her deeper into a life of crime. But somewhere in the darkness of her despair, a spark of determination still burned. She'd survived her stepfather's cruelty and the brutal journey west. She'd endured weeks of backbreaking labor and the constant fear of discovery. Whatever came next, she would find a way to survive it too. The mountain wind howled through the camp, carrying with it the scent of snow and the promise of winter storms. In the distance, the mine entrance gaped like an open wound, waiting to swallow them all. And somewhere in that darkness, Clara May Whitmore prepared for the most dangerous journey of her life. The supply shed behind the camp's kitchen offered temporary shelter from the biting wind, but Clara knew their hiding place wouldn't remain safe for long. Through gaps in the wooden walls, she could see lanterns moving through the camp as Dutch Morrison and Deputy Marshal Hayes began their search. Their voices carried across the frosty air, coordinating the systematic inspection of every building and bunkhouse. Marcus crouched beside her, his breathing controlled despite their desperate flight. In the dim light filtering through the sheds walls, his face appeared carved from stone, all sharp angles and cold calculation. "They'll search this place within the hour," he whispered. "We need to move." "Where?" Clara asked, pulling her thin jacket tighter against the cold. The whole territory will be looking for us by morning. There's an abandoned mine shaft about 5 miles up the mountain. Old silver claim that played out years ago. The tunnels run deep enough to hide an army, and there's only one entrance they'd have to watch. Clara stared at him through the darkness. You've been planning this for a while, haven't you? The theft, the escape route, none of this is improvised. Marcus's smile was barely visible in the shadows. I've been planning it since the day I arrived in Copper Ridge. The only variable was finding the right partner, someone desperate enough to help but not stupid enough to get us both killed. The casual admission of his manipulation hit Clara like a physical blow. She'd been nothing more than a tool in his elaborate scheme, a convenient accomplice whose desperation made her controllable. You never intended to just steal the payroll and leave, did you? You wanted someone to take the blame. Originally. Yes, but circumstances change. Now we're both fugitives, which means we sink or swim together. Marcus peered through a gap in the wall, watching the search pattern of the approaching lanterns. The question is whether you're ready to do what it takes to survive out there. Before Clara could respond, the sound of boots on gravel announced the arrival of searchers near their hiding place. Through the wall, she could hear Dutch Morrison's voice giving instructions to several miners who'd volunteered to help with the manhunt. Check every building, every storage shed, every place where someone might hide, Dutch was saying. And remember, we're looking for at least one person, possibly two. The handwriting expert thinks our imposter might have an accomplice. Clara's heart sank. Somehow Hayes had deduced that she wasn't working alone. The web of suspicion was expanding, and soon it would catch them both at its strands. Marcus was already moving, gathering supplies from the shed's shelves, rope, a small hatchet, some preserved food that the kitchen staff stored for emergencies. His movements were swift and silent, those of a man accustomed to quick escapes and desperate situations. Take only what you can carry easily, he instructed Clara. We'll be traveling fast through rough country. Clara grabbed a heavy coat that hung on a peg near the door and stuffed her pockets with dried meat and hardtack. The food would keep them alive for a few days, but beyond that lay uncertainty and the harsh reality of winter in the Colorado mountains. The back door of the shed opened onto a narrow path that led toward the tree line. Marcus checked the route carefully before stepping outside, his hand resting on the knife at his belt. Clara followed, her boots crunching softly on the frost-covered ground. They made it perhaps 50 yards before the shout rang out behind them. There! 2 figures heading for the trees. The voice belonged to Tom Fisher, the miner who'd been injured in the mess hall fight. Clara felt a stab of irony. The man she'd used to create her distraction was now the one exposing their escape. Run, Marcus commanded, and they broke into a desperate sprint toward the forest. Behind them, the camp erupted into activity. Lanterns swung wildly as men rushed to join the pursuit, their voices creating a cacophony of shouts and instructions. Clara could hear Dutch Morrison's authority cutting through the chaos, organizing the search parties and directing them toward different routes up the mountain. The tree line offered temporary concealment, but Clara knew their pursuers would be close behind. The miners knew these mountains intimately, and many of them were experienced hunters who could track prey through terrain that would defeat a city dweller. Marcus set a punishing pace, leading them up steep slopes and through dense stands of pine and aspen. The altitude made Clara's lungs burn, but she forced herself to keep up, knowing that falling behind meant capture and exposure. Branches tore at her clothing and scratched her face, but she pressed on through the darkness. After what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, Marcus finally called a halt beside a rushing mountain stream. Clara collapsed against a fallen log, gasping for breath and fighting the urge to vomit from exhaustion. "We can rest for 5 minutes," Marcus said, his own breathing heavy but controlled. "Drink some water and catch your breath, but stay alert. They're still following us." Clara cupped her hands in the icy stream and drank deeply. the cold water shocking her system back to alertness. Around them, the forest was alive with small sounds, the rustle of nocturnal animals, the whisper of wind through pine needles, the distant howl of a coyote somewhere higher up the mountain. "How far to this mine shaft of yours?" she asked when she could speak again. "Another 3 miles, maybe 4. The path gets rougher from here, but that might work in our favor. Most of the miners won't be equipped for serious mountain climbing in the dark." As if summoned by his words, the distant sound of voices drifted through the trees. Their pursuers were closer than Clara had hoped, moving with determination despite the difficult terrain. "Time to go," Marcus said, rising to his feet with fluid grace. The next phase of their climb was a nightmare of loose rocks and hidden ravines. Clara slipped repeatedly, her hands becoming scraped and bloody from grabbing at sharp stones and thorny bushes. Marcus seemed to navigate the treacherous ground effortlessly, as if he'd traveled this route many times before. It was during one particularly difficult stretch, as they worked their way around a steep drop-off, that Clara finally understood the full scope of Marcus's deception. "You've been to this mine before," she said, pausing to catch her breath on a narrow ledge. "This isn't just some hiding place you heard about. You've been planning to use it all along." Marcus glanced back at her, his face unreadable in the starlight. "I spent 2 weeks exploring these mountains when I first arrived at Copper Ridge. A man in my line of work always needs an exit strategy." "What exactly is your line of work?" Clara demanded. "And don't tell me you're just a miner looking to make some extra money." For a long moment, Marcus said nothing. Then, as they resumed their climb, he began to speak in a voice so quiet she had to strain to hear him over the sound of their footsteps on loose rock. "I was a detective once. Worked for the Pinkerton Agency, tracking down criminals and recovering stolen property. Good at my job, too good maybe. I got assigned to investigate a railroad robbery in Kansas, spent months building a case against the gang responsible." He paused to help Clara navigate a particularly treacherous section of the path, his grip strong and steady on her arm. Turned out the railroad executives were in on the theft. They'd hired the gang to steal their own payroll shipment so they could collect the insurance money and avoid paying their workers. When I discovered the truth and tried to report it, I found out how deep the corruption went. The Pinkertons were being paid to look the other way. Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "What did you do?" "I tried to do the right thing. Took my evidence to the territorial marshal, thinking honest law enforcement would want to know about the conspiracy. Instead, I found myself framed for the very crimes I'd been investigating. Had to disappear before they could arrest me for theft and murder." The revelation explained so much: Marcus's skills with locks, his knowledge of law enforcement procedures, his ability to plan and execute complex schemes. But it also raised new questions about his motives and methods. "So now you actually steal payrolls instead of investigating the theft?" Clara asked. "I take what I need to survive. The system I once served branded me a criminal, so I decided to live up to their expectations." Marcus's voice carried a bitterness that seemed to cut through the cold mountain air. "At least when I steal, I'm honest about what I'm doing." They continued climbing in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Clara found herself reassessing everything she believed about Marcus Sullivan. He wasn't simply a greedy criminal. He was a man who'd been betrayed by the very institutions he'd sworn to serve. In some ways, his story mirrored her own flight from injustice and abuse, but understanding his motives didn't excuse his actions. The miners at Copper Ridge were honest men who worked brutal jobs for modest wages. Stealing from them was still wrong. Regardless of Marcus's personal grievances against the system, the abandoned mine appeared suddenly out of the darkness, its entrance little more than a black hole in the mountainside. Rotting timber supports framed the opening, and rusty rails disappeared into the depths beyond. Marcus produced a small lantern from his pack and lit it carefully, shielding the flame from the wind. This tunnel goes back about a quarter-mile before it branches into 3 separate shafts, he explained, leading the way into the darkness. The middle shaft has a chamber with a natural spring and some flat ground where we can rest. The other 2 lead to dead ends, which means anyone trying to follow us will have to split their forces. The tunnel was a tomb of dead dreams and abandoned hopes. Clara could see the marks where miners had blasted and chipped away at the rock, searching for silver that had ultimately proved too sparse to justify continued operation. The air smelled of dampness and decay, with an underlying metallic tang that spoke of long-dormant minerals. Their footsteps echoed strangely in the confined space, creating phantom sounds that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Clara found herself jumping at shadows, her nerves stretched to the breaking point by the combination of exhaustion and fear. The chamber Marcus had described proved to be a natural cavity in the rock, perhaps 30 feet across and high enough to stand upright. A small spring bubbled up from a crack in the floor, creating a pool of clear water that reflected their lantern light like a mirror. Someone had left behind a few basic supplies, blankets, canned goods, and a small camp stove that suggested this hideout had been used before. Whose supplies are these? Clara asked, sinking down onto one of the blankets with relief. Mine. I've been preparing this place for weeks, bringing up supplies a little at a time during my off-duty hours. Marcus began organizing their meager possessions, his movements efficient and practiced. There's enough food and water here to last 2 people about a month, assuming we're careful with our consumption. Clara stared at him in the flickering lamplight. A month? You think we'll be hiding here for a month? I think we'll be hiding here until the search dies down and we can figure out our next move. Winter's coming, which means the passes will be snowed in soon. Even if they want to keep looking for us, they won't be able to bring in reinforcements or expand the search area. The logic was sound but terrifying. Clara had fled her stepfather's house to avoid being trapped, only to find herself trapped again in a much more literal sense. The mountain had become her prison, and Marcus Sullivan was both her fellow inmate and her jailer. Outside, the wind howled through the mine entrance, carrying with it the promise of the storm that had been building all evening. Clara pulled one of the blankets around her shoulders and tried to process everything that had happened. Less than 24 hours ago, she'd been a miner named Sam Whitmore, working hard but living free. Now she was a fugitive hiding in an abandoned mine with a man whose past was as dark and complicated as her own. What happens when the month is over? She asked. Where do we go from here? Marcus was quiet for a long time, staring into the small fire he'd built in a makeshift hearth of stacked stones. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful and distant. South, probably, Mexico, if we can make it that far. New names, new lives, new chances to disappear into something better than what we're running from. Clara closed her eyes, trying to imagine a future that seemed as distant and uncertain as the stars hidden beyond the mountain peaks. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and impossible choices. But tonight, in the depths of an abandoned mine, she was alive and free from the immediate threat of discovery. The fire crackled softly in the silence, casting dancing shadows on the rough stone walls. Somewhere above them, men with lanterns and rifles continued their search through the forest, following cold trails and false leads. And somewhere far below, in the darkness of her makeshift sanctuary, Clara May Whitmore prepared for whatever tomorrow might bring. 3 days into their underground exile, Clara discovered that hiding in an abandoned mine was far different from working in one. The oppressive silence pressed against her eardrums like a physical weight, broken only by the constant drip of water from somewhere deeper in the tunnels and the occasional whisper of wind from the entrance. The lantern light created a small circle of warmth and visibility, beyond which lay an endless void that seemed to swallow sound and hope alike. Marcus had established a routine that spoke of military precision and long experience with survival. Situations. They conserve the lamp oil by keeping the light burning only during meals and necessary activities, spending most of their time in complete darkness. Water was rationed despite the natural spring, and food was measured out with mathematical precision to ensure their supplies would last. But it was the enforced intimacy of their situation that proved most challenging for Clara in the mining camp. She'd been able to maintain her disguise through constant vigilance and careful avoidance of personal interactions. Here, trapped in a space barely larger than a modest bedroom, every gesture and mannerism was subject to Marcus's intense scrutiny. "You know," Marcus said during their morning meal on the fourth day, "you can stop pretending to be Sam Whitmore now. There's no one here to fool except yourself." Clara looked up from her meager portion of beans and hardtack, meeting his steady gaze across the small fire. "I don't know what you mean. You're still sitting like a man, walking like a man, keeping your voice artificially low, even though we both know the truth." Marcus leaned back against the stone wall, his expression thoughtful. "After everything we've been through, don't you think it's time to drop the act?" The suggestion terrified Clara more than she cared to admit. For weeks, Sam Whitmore had been her armor, her protection against a world that saw women as property, to be controlled and exploited. Without that identity, she felt naked and vulnerable in ways that had nothing to do with physical exposure. "Sam kept me safe," she said quietly. Clara May Whitmore was just a girl running from a man who thought he owned her. Sam was someone who could work, who could survive, who could make his own choices. And now, what is Clara May Whitmore now? The question hung in the air like smoke from their fire. Clara had been so focused on survival, on maintaining her deception, and staying one step ahead of discovery, that she'd never considered what came after. Who was she when stripped of both her original identity and her carefully constructed disguise? "I don't know," she admitted. "I've been pretending to be someone else for so long. I'm not sure I remember who I really am." Marcus nodded as if he'd expected that answer. "I understand that feeling. When the Pinkertons branded me a criminal, I had to become someone else too. Marcus Sullivan isn't even my real name." Clara felt a shock of recognition. "What is your real name?" "David Cameron. I was born in Philadelphia, son of a minister who believed in justice and moral righteousness. Joined the Pinkertons because I thought I could make a difference, help protect honest people from those who would prey on them." His laugh was bitter and self-deprecating. "Turns out the world is more complicated than my father's sermon suggested." The revelation created a strange intimacy between them, two people who'd both abandoned their original selves in pursuit of survival. Clara found herself studying Marcus David with new eyes, seeing past the hardened criminal to the idealistic young man he must have once been. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because we're going to be stuck together for a long time, and lies get heavier the longer you carry them. Also because ... He paused, seeming to struggle with his words. "Because I think I misjudged you. From the beginning." "How so?" "I thought you were just another desperate person I could manipulate. Someone weak enough to be controlled by threats and blackmail. But watching you these past few days, seeing how you've handled this situation, you're stronger than I gave you credit for." Clara felt a flush of warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. Strong enough to survive being trapped in a mine with a criminal? Strong enough to survive being trapped in a mine with another human being who's made some terrible choices, but is trying to figure out how to make better ones. The conversation was interrupted by a sound that made both of them freeze, the distant echo of voices coming from the mine entrance. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs as she recognized the authoritative tone of Deputy Marshal Hayes carrying through the tunnels. Marcus was already moving, extinguishing their fire and gathering their essential supplies. "Back tunnel," he whispered. "Move quietly." They retreated deeper into the mine, following a narrow passage that led away from the main chamber. Clara carried their water containers, while Marcus shouldered their food supplies and weapons. Behind them, the voices grew louder as the search party entered their hideout. "Fresh ashes in this fire," Hayes was saying. "Can't be more than an hour old. They're definitely using this place." "Could be long gone by now," Dutch Morrison replied, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "These tunnels connect to at least 3 other shafts. They could have slipped out while we were climbing up here." "Maybe, but we're going to search every inch of this place before we give up. I want 2 men in each tunnel, and I want them moving slow and careful. Our fugitives are armed and desperate." Clara and Marcus continued their retreat through the increasingly narrow passage, feeling their way through the darkness with their hands extended in front of them. The tunnel floor was treacherous with loose rocks and unexpected drops, and Clara bit back a cry of pain when her shin connected with a hidden boulder. They traveled in silence for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the searchers. Finally, Marcus called a halt in a small chamber where the tunnel branched in 3 directions. "This is as far as I've explored," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "From here, we're in unknown territory." Clara sank down against the tunnel wall, her legs shaking from exhaustion and fear. They'd escaped immediate capture, but at the cost of abandoning their supplies and shelter. Now they were lost in the labyrinthine depths of the mountain, with no food, no water, and no light source except the small lantern Marcus carried. "How long will they search?" she asked. "Hayes is thorough. He'll spend at least a day going through every tunnel and chamber in the main section. But winter's coming, and he can't afford to keep his men up here indefinitely. If we can stay hidden for another week, they might give up and wait for spring." The prospect of spending a week in these dark tunnels with minimal supplies and no way to know if they were moving deeper into the mountain or toward another exit was almost too terrifying to contemplate. Clara closed her eyes and tried to summon the strength that had carried her this far. "David," she said, using his real name for the first time. "What you said earlier about making better choices, did you mean it?" "Yes, why?" "Because I've been thinking about those miners back at Copper Ridge. They're good men, working hard jobs for wages that barely keep their families fed. If we'd succeeded in stealing that payroll... We didn't succeed, and we're not going to try again." Clara opened her eyes, trying to see his expression in the darkness. "You're giving up on the theft?" "I'm giving up on a lot of things. This whole experience has made me realize that I've been running from my problems instead of facing them. Maybe it's time to stop running. What does that mean for us?" David was quiet for a long time, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight of decision that seemed to fill the small chamber. "It means that when we get out of this mountain, and we will get out, we're going to find a way to make things right, starting with ourselves." The promise hung between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. Clara wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that they could find redemption together. But she'd learned to be cautious about trusting anyone, especially someone who'd already proven capable of deception and manipulation. Their conversation was cut short by a new sound echoing through the tunnels, not voices this time, but the rhythmic tapping of metal on stone. Someone was using a pick or hammer to test the tunnel walls, probably searching for hidden passages or chambers. "They're being more thorough than I expected," David murmured. "We need to keep moving." They chose the middle passage and began another retreat deeper into the mountain. This tunnel was older than the others, carved by hand rather than blasted with explosives. The walls showed tool marks from picks and chisels, speaking of desperate men who'd spent months chasing veins of ore that never materialized. As they walked, Clara found herself thinking about the miners who'd worked these passages decades ago. Men like the ones at Copper Ridge, probably hopeful souls who'd come west chasing dreams of wealth and independence. Most of them had found only backbreaking labor and disappointment, just as she had found only deception and danger. "David," she said softly. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "When you were investigating that railroad theft in Kansas, what made you decide to do the right thing even when it meant destroying your career?" David's footsteps paused, and Clara could feel him considering the question. "My father, I suppose. For all his faults, he raised me to believe that the truth matters more than personal comfort. When I discovered that conspiracy, I couldn't just walk away and pretend I didn't know, even though it cost you everything. Everything I thought I wanted, maybe. But I've learned that sometimes losing everything is the only way to discover what actually matters." Clara pondered this as they continued through the darkness. Her own flight from home had cost her family, security, and the simple comfort of being herself. But it had also given her strength she'd never known she possessed, and shown her that she could survive circumstances that would have broken the sheltered girl she'd once been. "What matters to you now?" she asked, honestly. "Right now it's making sure you get out of this mountain alive. Everything else feels secondary to that." The admission surprised Clara with its sincerity. For weeks, she'd seen David as her captor and manipulator, the man who'd trapped her in an impossible situation. But somewhere in the darkness of their shared exile, he'd become something else. A partner, perhaps even a protector. "Why do you care what happens to me?" she asked. David's answer came after a long pause, his voice soft with something that might have been vulnerability. "Because when I look at you, I see who I used to be before the world broke me. You still have the courage to fight for what's right, even when it's dangerous. I don't want to be responsible for destroying that." Clara felt tears prick at her eyes, though whether from exhaustion, fear, or unexpected emotion, she couldn't say. For the first time since leaving her stepfather's house, someone was seeing her not as property to be controlled or a tool to be used, but as a person worthy of protection and respect. The tunnel ahead split again, offering them a choice between paths that led into equal darkness. David held up his lantern, studying the options with the careful attention of a man whose decisions carried life or death consequences, left or right. He asked. Clara considered the question, not just about the tunnel, but about everything that had brought them to this moment. "Left," she said finally. "It feels like it's leading upward." As they turned into the left passage, Clara realized that for the first time in months, she wasn't entirely alone. The man beside her had his own dark past and questionable choices, but he was also someone who understood the weight of secrets and the cost of survival. Whatever lay ahead in the darkness, they would face it together. The tunnel sloped upward, just as Clara had hoped, and she could feel the faintest whisper of moving air that suggested a connection to the surface somewhere above. Behind them, the sounds of the search party grew fainter, muffled by distance and the maze of abandoned workings. They climbed steadily through the darkness, two fugitives bound together by circumstances they'd never chosen, but could no longer escape. And somewhere in that shared struggle, Clara May Whitmore began to understand that sometimes the most unexpected partnerships could lead to the most profound transformations. The upward tunnel proved to be a test of endurance that pushed both Clara and David to their physical limits. What had seemed like a gradual incline in the darkness revealed itself to be a steep, treacherous climb through passages barely wide enough for one person. Loose rocks shifted underfoot with every step, threatening to send them tumbling back into the depths they'd fought so hard to escape. Clara's hands were raw and bleeding from gripping the rough stone walls, but she pressed on with desperate determination. Behind them, the sounds of the search party had faded to nothing, swallowed by the maze of tunnels and the increasing distance. Whether that meant safety or that they were hopelessly lost, she couldn't tell. "There," David said suddenly, his voice tight with exhaustion. "Do you feel that?" Clara paused in her climbing, suddenly aware of what he meant. The air moving past her face was no longer the stale, dead atmosphere of the deep mine. It carried scents of pine and snow, the crisp freshness of the mountain night. We're close to the surface, she breathed. Very close. This tunnel must connect to one of the old ventilation shafts. David's lantern revealed another junction ahead, but this time one of the passages showed a faint gray rectangle of starlight. There's our way out. The final stretch was the most difficult yet. A narrow chimney that required them to brace their backs against one wall while pushing with their feet against the other. Clara's muscles screamed in protest, but the promise of open sky and fresh air drove her upward through the claustrophobic space dot when she finally hauled herself through the opening and onto solid ground. The relief was so overwhelming that she collapsed onto the frost-covered earth, gasping for breath and fighting back. Tears. They had emerged onto a small ledge perhaps 300 feet above the valley floor. Hidden among a cluster of boulders and stunted pine trees, David appeared beside her moments later, his face pale with exhaustion, but his eyes bright with triumph. "We made it," he said, as if he couldn't quite believe it himself. Clara sat up slowly, taking in their surroundings. The ledge was small but defensible, with a clear view of the valley below and multiple escape routes if they needed to move quickly. More importantly, they were far from the main mine entrance where the search party was concentrated. "How did you know about this shaft?" she asked. "I didn't. I was hoping, but I didn't know for certain." David settled down beside her, his breathing still labored. "Sometimes you have to trust that the mountain will provide a way out, even when logic says you're trapped." The valley spread out below them like a map drawn in silver and shadow. Clara could see the lights of Copper Ridge glowing in the distance. And beyond that, the ribbon of road that led back towards civilization. It looked peaceful from this height, giving no hint of the chaos and danger they'd left behind. "What now?" Clara asked. "We can't go back to the camp, and winter's coming fast. In a few weeks, these mountains will be impassable." David was quiet for a long time, studying the landscape with the focused attention of a man making crucial decisions. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a resolve that surprised Clara with its strength. "I've been thinking about what I said earlier, about making things right. There's something I need to tell you, something that changes everything about our situation." Clara felt a familiar chill of apprehension. "What kind of something?" "The payroll money we were trying to steal. It wasn't the first theft plan for Copper Ridge. I've been watching that camp for 3 months, and there have been at least 2 other attempts by different groups of criminals. Someone's been passing information to organized gangs, telling them when money shipments arrive and how the security is arranged." The revelation hit Clara like a physical blow. "You think there's an informant in the camp?" "I know there is. I've been gathering evidence since I arrived, trying to identify who's been selling information to the criminal gangs operating in this region." David reached into his jacket and pulled out a small notebook, its pages filled with cramped handwriting. "Everything's in here. Names, dates, patterns of theft attempts that coincide with specific personnel schedules." Clara stared at the notebook, her mind racing through the implications. "You weren't just planning to steal the payroll. You were investigating the thefts." "I was investigating them, yes. But I was also planning to steal the money." David's honesty was stark and unflinching. "I told myself that taking one payroll to fund my escape was justified, because I was also stopping a larger criminal conspiracy. It was a convenient rationalization for doing something I knew was wrong." The admission hung between them like a confession in a church. Clara found herself reassessing everything she thought she knew about David Cameron and his motives. "What made you change your mind?" "You did." David's answer was simple and direct. "Watching you struggle with the moral weight of what we were doing. Seeing how much it cost you to even consider stealing from those miners. It reminded me of who I used to be before I let bitterness and self-pity corrupt my judgment." Clara felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with their small fire. "So what do we do with this information?" "We use it to clear our names and stop the real criminals. But first, we need to get closer to the camp without Being seen. I need to retrieve some additional evidence I hid in my bunk, and we need to find a way to contact Deputy Marshal Hayes without getting ourselves arrested. The plan was audacious and dangerous, requiring them to return to the very place where every law enforcement officer in the territory was searching for them. But Clara found herself nodding agreement, energized by the prospect of finally doing something unambiguously right. "There's a problem, though," she said. "Even if we can prove there's an informant in the camp, it doesn't change the fact that my disguise has been exposed. Hayes and Dutch Morrison know there's a woman hiding among the miners." David studied her, face in the starlight, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe it's time to stop hiding who you are. Clara May Whitmore might be exactly the witness they need to break this case open." The suggestion terrified Clara more than facing down armed criminals or climbing through abandoned mine shafts. For months, her identity as Sam Whitmore had been her shield against a world that saw women as possessions to be controlled. Revealing herself as Clara would mean vulnerability, exposure, and the possibility that she might be dragged back to face her stepfather's wrath. "I can't," she whispered. "If they find out who I really am, they'll send me back to Silas, and he'll make sure I never run away again." David reached out and took her hand, his grip warm and steady. "Not if you're under the protection of federal law enforcement. A witness in a major criminal investigation can't be returned to an abusive guardian, especially not when that witness has risked her life to expose the truth." Clara wanted to believe him, but years of powerlessness had taught her to be skeptical of promises from men, even well-meaning ones. "How can you be sure?" "Because I know Deputy Marshal Hayes. We worked together on a case in Kansas before my troubles with the Pinkertons began. He's an honest man who cares more about justice than politics or social conventions. If we can prove our information is legitimate, he'll protect you from anyone who tries to drag you back to a life you don't want." The possibility of freedom. Real freedom, not just the desperate flight she'd been engaged in for months, was almost too wonderful to contemplate. Clara found herself imagining a life where she could be herself without fear, where her choices belonged to her alone. "What if you're wrong about Hayes?" she asked. "What if he decides I'm just a runaway girl who needs to be returned to her family? Then we'll run again, as far and as fast as we need to." "But Clara, you can't spend your whole life hiding from who you are. At some point, you have to trust that there are people in this world who will see your worth and fight to protect it." The words struck something deep inside Clara's chest, a longing she'd been carrying since childhood for someone to see her as valuable in her own right. Her father had loved her before consumption took him, but even he had seen her primarily as someone who needed protection rather than someone capable of protecting others. "If we do this," she said slowly, "if we go back and try to expose this conspiracy, I need you to promise me something. Anything. If something goes wrong, if they try to arrest us or send me back to Silas, you run. Don't sacrifice yourself trying to save me. I've been taking care of myself for a long time, and I can keep doing it if I have to." David's grip on her hand tightened. "That's not a promise I can make." "Why not?" "Because somewhere in these mountains, I stopped thinking of you as a tool to be used or a problem to be solved. You became someone I care about, someone worth protecting even if it costs me everything I have left." The declaration hit Clara with unexpected force. In all her years of running and hiding, no one had ever said they cared about her survival more than their own. The words awakened something in her chest that she'd thought was dead, the capacity to trust another person completely. "David," she said softly, "I need you to know something too." "What's that?" "When you first discovered my secret and started blackmailing me, I hated you. I thought you were just another man trying to control me for his own benefit. But these past few days, watching you wrestle with your choices and seeing how you've tried to protect me even when it puts you at risk, I don't hate you anymore. What do you feel now?" Clara took a deep breath, summoning the courage to speak a truth that frightened her more than any physical danger they'd faced. I feel like maybe I found the first person in my life who sees my heart instead of just my usefulness. The words hung between them in the cold mountain air, charged with possibilities that neither of them had expected when they first entered the abandoned mine as fugitives. Somewhere in the depths of the earth, two broken people had found something worth rebuilding their lives around. David leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper. Clara May Whitmore, when we get out of this mountain and clear our names, I want you to know that you'll never have to hide who you are again. Not from me, not from anyone. Your heart is the most valuable thing about you, and anyone who can't see that doesn't deserve a place in your life. Clara felt tears streaming down her cheeks, but for the first time in months, they were tears of hope rather than despair. Promise me, she said. I promise. And Clara, yes? When this is all over, I'd like to court you properly. Not as Sam Whitmore or any other disguise, but as the remarkable woman you've always been underneath. The proposal was so unexpected and so perfectly right that Clara couldn't find words to respond. Instead, she leaned forward and kissed him, tasting the salt of her own tears and the promise of a future she'd never dared to imagine. When they finally broke apart, the valley below seemed less threatening and the path ahead less impossible. They were still fugitives hiding on a mountain ledge, still facing enormous risks in their plan to expose the criminal conspiracy. But they were no longer alone in their struggle. As dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Clara May Whitmore prepared to stop running and start fighting for the life she deserved. The mountain had tested her strength and revealed her heart. Now it was time to find out if the world below was ready to accept both. The descent from their mountain refuge proved far more treacherous than their escape from the mine. Dawn brought with it a bitter wind that cut through their inadequate clothing and made every handhold slippery with frost. Clara's fingers were numb within minutes, but she forced herself to maintain a steady pace as they picked their way down the rocky slope toward the valley floor. David had spent the early morning hours studying the camp through a small spyglass he'd produced from his seemingly endless supply of hidden tools. The search parties had returned before sunrise, their lanterns creating moving constellations of light as they reported back to Deputy Marshal Hayes and Dutch Morrison. They're pulling back to establish a perimeter around the main approaches to the camp, David explained as they navigated a particularly difficult section of loose shale. Hayes thinks we'll try to steal horses and escape toward Denver. Won't we? Clara asked, pausing to catch her breath on a narrow ledge. Eventually, but not the way he expects. First, we need to get into my old bunk and retrieve the evidence I've been collecting. Then we need to set a trap for our real criminal. Clara studied his profile as he scanned the terrain below. You know who the informant is, don't you? David's jaw tightened. I have a strong suspicion, but I need proof. Accusations without evidence won't convince Hayes, especially coming from two fugitives with our own criminal intentions. The identity of the traitor had been nagging at Clara since David's revelation. Someone in the camp had been selling information to criminal gangs, someone trusted enough to know about payroll schedules and security arrangements. The list of possibilities was disturbingly short. They reached the tree line as the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows through the pine forest. David led them through a circuitous route that avoided the main trails, following what appeared to be an old game path that wound between the largest trees. Clara marveled at his woodcraft. For a city-born detective, he moved through the wilderness with surprising skill. How did you learn to navigate like this? She asked during a brief rest. Necessity. When you're a wanted man, you develop all sorts of useful skills. David's smile was rueful. I spent 6 months hiding in the forests of Kansas before I made my way west. Amazing what you can learn when your life depends on it. The admission reminded Clara of how much they still didn't know about each other's pasts. David had shared the broad outlines of his fall from grace, but the details of his fugitive years remained largely mysterious. She found herself curious about the experiences that had shaped him into the complex man beside her. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. David immediately pulled Clara behind the massive trunk of an ancient pine, pressing his finger to his lips for silence. Through the trees, she could see two riders moving slowly along a trail perhaps 50 yards away. One of the horsemen was unmistakably Deputy Marshal Hayes, his badge glinting in the dappled sunlight. The other rider took Clara a moment to identify: Patrick O'Brien, the kind Irish miner who'd befriended her during her first days at Copper Ridge. Expanded the search to include the old mining claims up Prospect Creek, Hayes was saying. If they're still in the area, we'll find them. Begging your pardon, Marshal, Patrick replied, but those two might be long gone by now. Smart enough to plan this whole scheme, they're probably smart enough to know when to cut and run. Clara felt a stab of hurt at hearing Patrick discuss her as a criminal. The man who'd shown her kindness and offered protection now saw her as nothing more than a thief and deceiver. The pain was sharper than she'd expected. David's hand found hers, offering silent comfort as they waited for the riders to pass. When the sound of hoofbeats finally faded, he squeezed her fingers gently. Patrick doesn't know the whole story, he whispered. When we clear this up, he'll understand. Clara nodded, but the encounter had driven home the magnitude of what they were attempting. Every person in Copper Ridge now saw them as criminals. Convincing anyone of their innocence would require not just evidence, but a complete reversal of everything the camp believed about recent events. They continued their careful approach to the mining settlement, using the terrain and vegetation to mask their movements. David's knowledge of the area was proving invaluable. He knew which ridges offered concealment and which valleys might hide patrol routes. As they drew closer to their destination, David began explaining his plan in greater detail. The evidence I need is hidden in a hollowed-out section of my bunk frame. Letters, schedules, notes about suspicious conversations, everything that points to our informant's identity. And how exactly do we get into the bunkhouse without being seen? We wait for the shift change. When the day crew goes down into the mines and the night crew comes up, there's usually a 20-minute window where the bunkhouses are nearly empty. David checked his pocket watch. That gives us about 3 hours to get into position. Clara felt her stomach clench with nervousness. 3 hours to prepare for what might be the most dangerous gamble of their lives. If they were caught in the camp, there would be no escape, no second chances. They would face immediate arrest and likely transportation back to face charges that could mean years in prison. But the alternative, remaining fugitives forever, always looking over their shoulders and never able to trust anyone, was equally unacceptable. Clara had spent too many months running and hiding. If David was right about Deputy Marshal Hayes, this might be their only chance at real freedom. They found a concealed position in a grove of aspen trees that offered a clear view of the camp while keeping them hidden from casual observation. David produced a small bag of dried fruit and nuts from his pack, their first real food since abandoning their mountain hideout. Tell me about the informant, Clara said as they shared their meager meal. What makes you so certain you know who it is? David was quiet for a moment, his eyes fixed on the distant buildings of Copper Ridge. Process of elimination, mostly. The information being sold required access to Dutch Morrison's office and knowledge of payroll schedules. That limits the suspects to maybe 5 people in the entire camp. Including Dutch himself? Including Dutch, though I don't think it's him. He's too invested in the camp's success to sabotage it for short-term profit. Same with Cookie and the other long-term employees. Clara felt a chill of understanding. You think it's someone who arrived recently, someone without deep ties to the camp. Someone who needed money quickly and had the skills to make contact with criminal organizations. David's voice was grim. Someone who saw an opportunity and took it, regardless of the consequences for the honest miners who would suffer. The description fit disturbingly well with someone Clara knew, though she hesitated to voice her suspicions. The accusation they were contemplating would destroy a man's life if they were wrong. But if they were right, that same man had already been destroying other lives for months. "Jake Brennan," she said finally. David nodded slowly. "Jake Brennan. Arrived at the camp 6 weeks before I did, just in time to learn the routines and identify the vulnerabilities. Has gambling debts that would motivate him to take risks for quick money. And most importantly, he's been present for every successful theft attempt in the past 3 months." Clara remembered her encounter with Brennan during the mess hall fight, the way he'd reacted to her planted note with explosive violence. At the time, she'd seen him as nothing more than a useful tool for creating a distraction. Now she wondered if his hair-trigger temper masked a more calculating intelligence. "How do we prove it?" "We set a trap. Make it appear that we've stolen something valuable and hidden it where only the informant would know to look. Then we watch to see who comes calling with criminal associates." The plan was elegant in its simplicity, but Clara could see a dozen ways it might go wrong. What if he doesn't take the bait? What if we're wrong about his identity? Then we improvise. "But Clara, I've been watching Jake Brennan for weeks now. He's our man, I'm certain of it." As the hours passed and the sun climbed toward its zenith, Clara found herself studying the camp below with new eyes. Somewhere among those buildings and honest miners lurked a traitor who'd been selling information to criminals. The thought made her angry in a way that surprised her with its intensity. These men worked brutal jobs in dangerous conditions for wages that barely supported their families. They deserved better than to have their livelihoods threatened by someone they trusted. If David was right about Jake Brennan, the man had been betraying his fellow workers for nothing more than personal greed. "David," Clara said as they prepared for their descent into the valley, "when we expose Brennan, what happens to us? Even if we clear our names, people will still know I spent weeks lying about who I was." David turned to face her, his expression serious but determined. "Then we'll deal with that together. Your courage and integrity will speak for themselves. Clara, anyone worth knowing will see past the deception to the reasons behind it." Clara wanted to believe him, but years of hiding had taught her that the world was rarely so forgiving of women who stepped outside accepted boundaries. Still, the alternative was a lifetime of running, and she was tired of being afraid. As the camp's noon whistle announced the shift change, Clara May Whitmore prepared to stop hiding and start fighting for the justice she'd never been offered. The mountain had tested her strength and revealed her heart. Now it was time to discover whether courage could triumph over corruption in the world below. The shift change at Copper Ridge unfolded exactly as David had predicted. Clara watched from their concealed position as tired miners emerged from the depths of the earth, while their replacements descended into darkness. The choreographed exchange lasted precisely 18 minutes, leaving the bunkhouses temporarily empty. Except for a few men too sick or injured to work, David moved with the fluid precision of someone who'd done this before, leading Clara through a careful approach that utilized every shadow and blind spot around the camp's perimeter. They reached the back wall of the east bunkhouse without detection, though Clara's heart hammered so loudly she was certain it could be heard 3 buildings away. The window David had identified proved easy to force, its latch weakened by mountain weather and neglect. Clara slipped through first, landing silently on the wooden floor beside the familiar rows of narrow bunks. The smell of unwashed bodies and tobacco smoke brought back vivid memories of her weeks living as Sam Whitmore. David's bunk was in the far corner, positioned where he could observe the entire room while appearing to mind his own business. Clara kept watch while he worked at the bedframe with a small knife, prying loose a section of wood that had been carefully hollowed out. Got it, he whispered, withdrawing a waterproof pouch from the hidden compartment. Letters, schedules. Everything we need to prove Brennan's been selling information. Clara felt a surge of relief, but it was short-lived. Through the window, she could see figures moving toward the bunkhouse. Not the returning miners they'd expected, but Deputy Marshal Hayes accompanied by 2 armed men. They're coming, she hissed. Back window now. But as they moved toward their escape route, the front door burst open. Hayes entered with his weapon drawn, his eyes immediately fixing on their position. David Cameron and Clara Whitmore, you're under arrest. Clara's blood turned to ice. Somehow Hayes had anticipated their plan and positioned himself to intercept them. The trap they'd thought to set had become a trap for themselves. Marshal Hayes, David said calmly, raising his hands but keeping the evidence pouch clutched in his fingers. I know how this looks, but we have information about the real criminal in this camp. The real criminal? Hayes's voice was skeptical, but not entirely dismissive. You mean someone other than the Pinkerton detective who turned outlaw and the runaway girl who's been deceiving honest miners for weeks? Jake Brennan has been selling payroll schedules to criminal gangs, David said. Everything's documented in this pouch: letters, coded messages, records of payments received. Hayes gestured for his men to stay alert while he considered David's words. Even if that's true, it doesn't excuse your own criminal intentions. You were planning to steal that payroll yourself. Yes, I was, David admitted. But circumstances change people, Marshal. Sometimes for the better. The honesty seemed to surprise Hayes. Clara stepped forward, her decision made in that instant to stop hiding behind Sam Whitmore's identity forever. Marshal Hayes, she said, her natural voice clear and steady. My name is Clara May Whitmore. I disguised myself as a man to escape an abusive stepfather who treated me like property. I came to this camp seeking honest work and the right to determine my own fate. Hayes studied her with professional interest. And the criminal conspiracy David mentions? I witnessed it by accident. Jake Brennan has been meeting with strangers in the old tunnels, passing information about security arrangements. David was trying to gather evidence to expose the conspiracy when I became involved. Convenient story, one of Hayes's deputies muttered. Before Hayes could respond, a commotion outside drew everyone's attention. Through the window, Clara could see Dutch Morrison approaching with Jake Brennan in tow, the latter's hands bound with rope. Marshal, Dutch called out. We caught this one trying to signal someone in the hills with a mirror. Found coded messages in his gear. Jake Brennan's face was a mask of sullen defiance as he was brought into the bunkhouse. His eyes swept the room, taking in the captured fugitives and the evidence pouch in David's hands. I don't know what they've been telling you, Brennan said, but they're the thieves. Caught them red-handed stealing from honest miners. David stepped forward, opening the waterproof pouch. Marshal, these documents prove that Brennan has been receiving payments from the Cortez gang in exchange for information about payroll deliveries. The handwriting matches samples we can obtain from camp records. Hayes examined the papers with growing interest. Clara watched his expression change from skepticism to grim understanding as he read through David's carefully gathered evidence. These dates correspond exactly with attempted thefts, Hayes said slowly. And this letter. He looked up at Brennan with undisguised disgust. You sold out your fellow miners for $30 a month. Brennan's composure finally cracked. You don't understand. I had debts. People who would have killed me if I didn't pay. I never meant for anyone to get hurt. Tell that to the families who would have starved if those payrolls had been stolen, Dutch Morrison said, his voice cold with contempt. Hayes turned back to David and Clara. Your evidence appears legitimate, and Brennan's reaction is as good as a confession. But that still leaves the question of your own criminal intentions. David met the marshal's gaze steadily. I planned to commit a crime, yes. But I didn't go through with it. partly because Clara showed me that there was a better way to handle the situation. If you check your own records, you'll find that no money was actually stolen, no minors were harmed, and the real criminal network has been exposed. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that justice sometimes requires forgiveness as well as punishment. Clara Whitmore deserves protection from an abusive guardian, not prosecution for seeking freedom. And perhaps a former detective who helped expose a criminal conspiracy deserves a second chance rather than a prison sentence. Hayes was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving between David, Clara, and the evidence of Brennan's betrayal. Finally, he holstered his weapon and addressed his deputies. Take Brennan into custody for conspiracy and accessory to attempted theft. Send word to Denver that we've broken up the information network that's been targeting mining camps. Clara felt her knees go weak with relief. And us? Hayes smiled for the first time since entering the bunkhouse. Miss Whitmore, as a key witness in this investigation, you'll be under federal protection until we can arrange proper legal guardianship that ensures your safety and freedom. As for you, Cameron. He paused, studying David with professional assessment. The Pinkerton Agency's corruption in Kansas has come to light. There are people in Denver who'd be interested in hearing your story and possibly offering you legitimate work again. David's face showed a mixture of hope and disbelief. You're not arresting us? I'm more interested in justice than punishment. You've both suffered enough, and you've done the right thing when it mattered most. Hayes turned to Clara. Miss Whitmore, you showed remarkable courage in surviving on your own and helping to expose this conspiracy. The territory needs people with your integrity. Clara felt tears streaming down her cheeks, but for the first time in years, they were tears of pure joy. Thank you, Marshal. Thank you for seeing who we really are. 3 weeks later, Clara stood on the porch of a small house in Denver, watching David return from his first day at the Territorial Marshal's office. The position of Special Investigator suited him perfectly, allowing him to use his detective skills in service of actual justice rather than corrupt politics. Clara herself had been appointed as a liaison between the Marshal's office and mining communities, helping to identify and prevent the kind of exploitation she'd witnessed at Copper Ridge. It was work that gave meaning to everything she'd endured. How was your day? David asked, climbing the steps with a smile that still made her heart race. Productive. I helped 3 women escape situations similar to mine, and we identified 2 more camps where criminal infiltration is suspected. Clara moved into his arms, marveling at how natural it felt to be held without fear. And yours? The Cortez gang has been completely dismantled. Jake Brennan's testimony helped us track down the entire network. David's expression grew serious. There's something else, though. I received a letter today. Clara felt a familiar chill of apprehension. From whom? Your stepfather. He's demanding your return, threatening legal action. David's grip tightened protectively around her. But Marshal Hayes has already responded. As a federal witness under official protection, you're beyond Silas Hartwell's reach. Clara closed her eyes, feeling the last chain of her past finally break. It's really over? It's really over. You're free, Clara, free to be exactly who you choose to be. That evening, as they sat together watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Clara reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The girl who'd cut off her hair and disguised herself as Sam Whitmore had been searching for safety and survival. What she'd found instead was something far more valuable. The courage to stop hiding and the love of a man who saw her heart. David, she said softly, do you ever regret the path that led us here? Never. Every mistake, every wrong turn, every moment of darkness, it all led me to you. David took her hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. And Clara, yes? When I said I wanted to court you properly, I meant it. I know we've been through extraordinary circumstances, but I want to do this right. With respect, with patience, with all the time you need to be certain. Clara smiled, remembering the desperate fugitives they'd been just weeks ago. I'm already certain, David Cameron. You saw my heart when I was still hiding behind a mask. You're the only man who's ever looked at me and seen someone worth protecting rather than someone to be controlled. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Clara May Whitmore knew she was finally home. Not in any building or town, but in the space between heartbeats, where two souls recognize each other across all the barriers the world had tried to build between them. The mountains that had tested her strength now stood as silent witnesses to her triumph. She'd entered them as a frightened girl in disguise and emerged as a woman unafraid to claim her place in the world. And beside her sat the man who'd helped her discover that the greatest treasure wasn't hidden in any mine shaft. It was the courage to love and be loved exactly as she was. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.